Every episode of Trade-Offs is grounded in rigorous research.
I don't think that the findings of this paper indicate that there are major clinical risks to patients.
Thoughtful conversations.
I also was thinking that a lot of the anger, while real, is somewhat misplaced.
And insights into what the latest in health policy means for you.
And every member of Congress should be asking questions on both sides of the aisle about, hey, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars. What are we getting for it?
We tell stories that cut through the noise, uncovering the data and personal stories that help you understand the stakes and the potential solutions to healthcare's toughest choices. Subscribe to Trade-Offs wherever you get your podcasts.
Support for The Nocturnist comes from the California Medical Association.
At The Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
In October 2005, Mike LeFever hovered in a helicopter over the Himalayas of North Pakistan. It was less than 48 hours after a devastating 7.6 magnitude earthquake. He told us the mountains looked like they had been sliced open with a hot butter knife. Whole hillside villages were wiped out. Survivors were grabbing at the helicopter, trying desperately to climb on board.
When I landed in Pakistan, it was chaos. It was people from all over the world trying to figure out how to help and how to get there. Over 80,000 people died on a Saturday morning, over 178,000 injured, and 3.5 billion people homeless.
The earthquake that hit India and Pakistan on October 8, 2005 was one of the most devastating in a century.
The devastation was nothing I had expected, nothing I had planned for. And so here I was, an admiral, sitting 700 miles from saltwater up in the Himalayas. And my good friend and classmate John Allen goes, "We always need a good admiral in the Himalayas."
Mike had no plan, no protocols to fall back on. Just a simple directive from his superiors: provide humanitarian aid and improve U.S. Pak relations. This is The Nocturnist, Uncertainty in Medicine. I'm Emily Silverman. Today we're joined by retired U.S. Navy Admiral Mike LeFever for our newest Uncertainty Profile, conversations with people who are skilled at navigating high uncertainty environments. In medicine, we make life or death decisions every day, but usually it's just one life at a time, one patient on the table, one diagnosis. In the military, those decisions play out on an entirely different scale. A single choice doesn't just affect one person. It can shape the lives of thousands, even the trajectory of entire regions. Mike is a career officer who spent nearly 4 decades navigating uncertainty in high-stakes environments. From 2008 to 2011, he led all U.S. armed forces in Pakistan during a time of immense geopolitical tension. And before that, in 2005, he found himself in an unexpected position, coordinating humanitarian aid in the aftermath of the earthquake in northern Pakistan. It was freezing cold in the Himalayas, resources were scarce, and Mike, a Navy admiral miles away from the nearest ocean, had no playbook.
Here I found myself in this very unique situation in an embassy with all these organizations and egos. I was the elephant in a room, so to speak, in a country that really didn't want me there.
Just days before the earthquake, Mike had been off the coast of Egypt, commanding a U.S. Navy strike group, 5,500 people, 6 ships, a few submarines, and an air wing. He'd been preparing for a 6-month deployment in the Middle East, but when the earthquake struck, he was diverted to Pakistan.
I could have easily came into that room and said, listen, nobody in the world operates at the scale and capability and capacity that we do. I have all the people, I have all the manpower, I have all the unique toys, and I could easily gone, okay, I'm in charge here, but we have a thing that talks about supporting relationships. And so in our environment, in this particular one, it was very clear that this was a mission about the United States providing support to Pakistan. And so I made it a part for us to check our egos at the door and to be that supporting relationship that says, how do I use my assets, the wonderful men, women, the tools, the equipment, and manpower to be able to support the overall mission of how the U.S. was going to help in Pakistan.
Mike told us that in moments like this, he thinks about navigation. First, know where you are, then know where you're going. It may sound simple, but in a disaster zone, it becomes a survival strategy. So Mike started coordinating basic aid, food, water, medical care, and then turned his focus to something that's usually outside the purview of the military, rebuilding schools.
Well, the schools were all devastated. A lot of the deaths, the 80,000 that were killed, were school children because it was a Saturday morning, people in schools. So one of the key things in a disaster thing is let's try to get to normalcy as soon as possible. And so my CBs, the women and men of the construction battalion, were building sea huts to provide classrooms.
At the time, someone from headquarters in Washington, D.C. raised concerns about the plan. They worried about staying within the usual boundaries of military involvement, that rebuilding civilian schools was traditionally the host country's responsibility. But Mike saw an opportunity for collaboration. His teams could build the temporary schools, while the Pakistani authorities provided the teachers and the books. If they could bend the rules, together they could help students get back to some sense of normalcy.
How do you find those common grounds? And how do you get through those first couple of no's to find a way that is doable for everybody and it takes everybody's consideration in mind? I think part of leading through uncertainty is to create that environment to allow people to be able to voice their concerns or have their problems, be able to talk them out and to really understand what's driving that reaction and to see whether or not there is some common ground that we can move to be able to solve the problem and work what's best for everybody. And so for the next 7 months, we grew the force over 1,500 people. We had 2 different hospitals, a MASH hospital, Navy Marine Corps hospital, in these very remote areas, providing level 3 care in environments that we're lucky to see any medical support whatsoever. It probably ended up being personally and professionally one of the most rewarding experiences that I had. Men and women that were in combat now repurposed to provide humanitarian assistance and aid. And so we were responsible at the end of the day probably for saving thousands of lives, which was quite impactful.
During his 7 months in Pakistan, Mike forged really strong relationships with local leaders and communities. And in 2007, Pakistan's president, President Musharraf, honored Mike with an award called the Crescent of Great Leader, one of Pakistan's highest civilian awards. Then, in 2008, Mike returned to Pakistan for what was supposed to be a 1-year assignment.
I was sent back to Pakistan in 2008, thought it was a 1-year assignment in the combat zone that ended up for 3 years all the way through the bin Laden raid. I tell people it was probably the most uncertain, unpredictable environment I ever operated in. I almost preferred to go to Afghanistan or Iraq because I knew we were at war and you had certain expectations of what that ensued. In Pakistan, it was in this quasi-state, but yet very much inside the gray zone. I was fortunate enough to command at every level, ships and squadrons and strike groups and now joint task forces, in conflict, in combat, and doing the full spectrum of operations. My top 3 priorities were relationships, relationships, relationships. You could have them in any order, but those were the top 3 priorities for my command environment. To be able to conduct operations, to conduct diplomacy, to have difficult conversations with our friends in their time of need, but also in achieving the strategic end state that we needed as a country to be able to take the fight to Al-Qaeda away from our shores and not have them attack inside the United States. And so it was over 3 years developing that. And then at the same time, being able to brief and translate that back to the president in monthly calls about the statuses of what was going on in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Mike says that this emphasis on relationships became particularly important after the bin Laden raid in 2011.
Obviously, there was operations along the border that I helped coordinate and control with Pakistan and Afghanistan and the ISAF forces. But they were very sensitive, a very proud nation. And of course, during the bin Laden raid, the idea that we basically invaded their country and took out the number one terrorist in an area that was basically a mile from where their version of their West Point was, as well as some of their weapons and nuclear storage facilities, was quite a shock to the system that we didn't give them any indication that we were going to be able to conduct that. So as you could imagine, that relationship was really frayed quite a bit.
Diplomatic ties were on the verge of collapse. But Mike had spent years in this country building trust that doesn't vanish overnight. So while many American officials were shut out, Mike remained one of the few people the Pakistani leadership was still willing to talk to. Learning to lead in hostile territory, Mike said, isn't just about showing up. It's about making hard decisions when everything is uncertain and the stakes couldn't be higher.
I remember back as a as a midshipman, a famous quote by John Paul Jones, the father of the Navy, that basically says, "He who will not risk cannot win." It's a great reminder, but in all these professions, when you think about this risk, it's acknowledging that, boy, there's so much uncertainty. It's recognizing that even with that incomplete information, that you did the best of your ability, that the information that you had, that this was the best way to do that. And, sometimes it's not going to work out. We all celebrate the wins and everybody loves that. And then there's times that you don't. And in medical as well, in my world, sometimes it meant writing letters to loved ones about not having their loved one returned to them. But at the time, it was in your best opinion that decision was what's going to be able to be best for what you needed to accomplish. What I've realized through time and leadership and experience is that everyone is very different on how they respond to the stresses, and also very different in how they incorporate that risk. I think in both the fields, I call it the good news, bad news. Good news is we compartmentalize very well. The bad news, we compartmentalize very well.
In medicine, just like in the military, there are hierarchies, chains of command, and while they can certainly be abused, they also serve a vital purpose: organizing chaos and clarifying responsibility. It's like when you walk onto a hospital ward, you want to know, who's in charge here? Who makes the decisions? And when things go sideways, who's accountable? I told Mike that it takes a certain kind of stuff to lead in high-stakes situations on the global stage. I wasn't sure that I could carry that weight, so I asked Mike where his courage comes from.
Self-confidence and adaptability. The self-confidence is that you have prepared the best way you can. But adaptability, there was a quote by a special operator, SEAL Eric Olson, that I used in my book that said, when the terrain and the map differ, go with the terrain. And it's like, oh yeah, I had this mapped out. This is where I was going to go. Well, you find out like, oh, I'm in a different spot than what I thought I was going to be. Staying on this course when it's clearly not the right course, and to be able to be confident that, okay, you can adapt and adjust to the environment that's around you.
And when you're leading a large team, so large that you can't possibly even know every person on your team, you still have to take responsibility. In Mike's case, for every single sailor on his ship.
I used to laugh sometimes when I'd be out, on a Saturday morning, whatever, with the kids or family running around in the soccer field. And I have a 17-year-old sailor on the ship that's responsible for checking these remote spaces in the ship. Well, if that individual didn't do it and the ship floods and it damages millions of dollars of equipment, yeah, that poor sailor, didn't do a job. But at the end of the day, whether military or in a surgery room, there is one person that's ultimately responsible. You can't have two captains of the ship, or you can't have, two admirals or two commanders of units or whatever.
What Mike's not naming here, but seems to be core to his philosophy on leadership, is humility. A leader is responsible for the outcome of a mission. No argument. But alongside that confidence, preparation, and adaptability, there's an understanding that the leader cannot work alone. The whole idea of a leader implies that there are other people being led, and those people's perspectives are valuable.
I thought it was a Churchill, but it's actually General Patton that basically says when two people are thinking alike, somebody's not thinking. And to me, it's such a great reminder that it's the diversity of thought and experiences that really contribute to the solution. One, it exposes you to different points of view. We all have strengths and weaknesses. And so ensuring that those weaknesses are filled by other folks to make sure you get a complete picture is, I think, important as a leader. But again, this idea that everybody contributes, no matter how big or small, that janitor that's sweeping the floor or cleaning up that medical trash in the hallway, or the restrooms, or the rest stop before the team goes into the OR or the ER, those contributions are just as important as me providing, 30 different helicopters and thousands of pounds of airlift and sea lift. It's about how do we work together to solve the issue.
Thanks for listening to The Nocturnus, Uncertainty in Medicine. Our core uncertainty team includes me, Emily Silverman, The Nocturnus head of story development, Molly Rose Williams, producer and editor Sam Osborne, and our uncertainty correspondent, Alexa Miller of Arts Practica. Our student producers are Claire Nimura and Celine Everett. Special thanks to Maggie Jackson and Paul Hahn. Our executive producer is Allie Block. Our program director is Ashley Pettit. Our original theme music was composed by Ashton Spencer, and additional music came from Blue Dot Sessions. Artwork for Uncertainty in Medicine was created by Eleni Depot, who is represented by Folio Illustration and Animation Agency. The Nocturnus Uncertainty in Medicine was made possible by generous support from the ABIM Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation. The Nocturnus title sponsor is the California Medical Association, a physician-led organization that works to keep the doctor-patient relationship at the heart of medicine. To learn more, visit cmadocs.org. The Nocturnus is also made possible by support from listeners like you. In fact, we recently moved over to Substack, which makes it easier than ever to support our work directly. By joining us for a monthly or annual membership, you'll become an essential part of our creative community. If you enjoy the show, consider signing up today at thenocturnus.substack.com. If you enjoy this episode, please share with a friend or colleague, post on social media, and help others find us by giving us a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. See you next week.